Good evening, everybody. Is this mic on? Great. It is an absolute delight to be with you all and to have the wonderful Tim Winton here with us to talk about this extraordinary book, Juice. What I really want to do, at least for the first third of this conversation, is let him open it up for us. I know it's just come out. I promise tonight there will be no spoilers, but we're going to have a good chunk of time, a whole hour with Tim, just to hear about what he was thinking about, where he takes us, where we take ourselves when we read this extraordinary book. Tim, I want to start at the very beginning. When we open the beginning of Juice, we're in a very desolate Australia. Tell us where we are and what the landscape looks like. What does it feel like?
Well, we're in the northwest of Western Australia. Surprise, surprise. Could have knocked myself down with a feather when that came out on the page. Anybody who's familiar, we know who had seen my documentary series Ningaloo Ningaloo will recognise many elements of the landscape. So we're north of well north of the 26th parallel. It's a tough desert maritime landscape. We're on a big peninsula where a kind of a rugged, rocky range breaks into the sea on one side and a big Gulf embayment on the other. And on the floodplain is where the people of the book live and try to make their way in pretty trying circumstances. I guess the circumstances include a kind of a weather conditions, or a setup of weather where really the heat means that in winter they can be out and about abroad in the sun, in the open sky, under the open sky, about until late morning. On a cooler day, they could perhaps extend it a little bit, but then they have to go inside because the heat is too much. So it's if you could imagine winter days in the mid to high 40s up into the early 50s. And in summer you have to live underground. Not so much because it's cooler underground, as I learnt from being 22 metres underground when I was making the series. It's the same temperature down there as it is on the surface. So if it's 40 degrees up there, it's 40 degrees 22 metres down, except it's just 100% humidity, which believe me, it's better to hear about than to experience. So people live 6 months of the year underground, mostly because the storm activity in the monsoon season is just so violent that you can't be up there. And so the people in the bulk of, or certainly the earlier part of the story, as it's told by the narrator, and I guess we can get to that setup in a minute. They make their living by catching and holding on to water on the very infrequent times that it rains. When it does rain, it just floods, so they capture water underground. And the rest of the time they're growing food to subsist on, but also to trade. And they have to do that in grow houses, which I guess are like greenhouses, except a greenhouse is meant to trap heat. These grow houses are meant to shed heat and protect plants from the direct effects of the sun and the wind. So they're horticulturalists, I guess. They call themselves homesteaders, this boy and his mum.
When are we? I mean, it seems like we're in the not too distant future. And it seemed clear that this is not a post-apocalyptic setting. There's not been like one thing that's happened. Tell us a bit about when the story takes place.
Yeah, well, it's probably fair to say it's post several apocalypses, if you like, but
not just the one.
Yeah, no, or cataclysms at the very least. I think in the end, I sort of danced around it a little bit. I didn't want to be too specific. but I think it's probably a century or two. It's definitely a bunch of generations hence, and it seems to be predicated on the idea that there have been a series of breakdowns, climate, a series of stepped kind of climate breakdowns that have triggered civil breakdowns, so that there is no nation state, there is no global international communications. People have resorted to having to reinvent themselves at a very small scale in order to adapt to the harsh conditions. For instance, their body weight is not, what we would recognise as a normal adult body weight. Their lifespan is shorter. Their fertility rate is much, much, much lower than ours, which is already, tanking, as we know. And because as anybody knows, when you try to protect your kids from direct sunlight, and you often pay a price for lack of vitamin D, is it D? So a lot of people in the around about have got rickets and other, and of course they all look sort of like people look already in the north of Australia, and they've got things growing on them because of the sun. The healthy ones look like lamingtons, and the others look like my dad, who these days, he's 93, he looks like a pizza that the seagulls are still arguing over. So yeah, they are us, but the life conditions are so challenging that it has changed not just their bodies, but it's changed their emotional palette, their emotional and physical and cultural aspirations. Everything is smaller.
So when the book opens, we meet a man and a child, and they're unnamed, and they remain unnamed. In fact, the central characters in the novel, the man, his mother, and the child, don't have names. And I wondered why you didn't want to give them that specificity.
I keep asking myself why. Maybe I just couldn't land on the right name. No, I think it's that as the reader discovers, we're probably getting ahead of ourselves, but he lives the bulk of his life after adolescence in secret, in a sense. He has a double life.
Yeah.
And part of that double life means not declaring, being perpetually anonymous. And I thought in the end, so he has a real name and he has a secret name, and I thought in the end it was less confusing not to reveal any of them. So should we just say what the setup is?
Well, I think I wanted to ask you about just, the first section of the book, when we start to jump around in time, is the man telling his story. Tell us where he's telling his story, and then I want to come back to him as a child and his mother and being on the homestead and what they do and how they live.
Well, the book sort of begins, and forgive me if you've already had a chance to read it. Hopefully on the page it sounds better than when I summarise it. I hope so. Otherwise, where did those years go?
He said to me on the phone, I don't want people to think it's doomy, which I thought was a great description. It's not so doomy. It's a bit doomy. It's quite doomy, but it's not all doomy.
Anyway, there's this bloke, and he's travelling across a particularly blighted landscape. He's on the run. He's become homeless and landless, and in his way, jobless. Which is all in our future. And he's got this kid in his company that it's not his child, but he's been tasked, or he's promised somebody to look after her and keep her safe. And they're in a vehicle that he's made himself, and they're chugging along, trying to find, in the south of Western Australia, trying to find a safe place. And what a safe place means really is a viable orderly, civilised settlement. So he's looking for other people who, in order to form alliances with, to join up with, for the sake of this child. And also because, conditions of life have changed in his lifetime, and, people have had to adapt once again to changed circumstances. So he's just looking for somewhere safe. So in the end, they suss out a few alternatives, and they clearly aren't what they're after, until they come upon an abandoned mine site, and he sees a mine shaft that looks like a good prospect, and just as he's sort of telling the little girl, this might do, somebody appears behind them, and obviously he's got there before them, and he's armed, and he's not particularly welcoming. So they find themselves captives. So the story essentially is this guy telling his captor down a mine shaft the story of his life, and trying to give him his bona fides, if you like, and telling him where he comes from, and they have. It turns out that he senses that they've got some things in common. But the other guy, the guy who's telling the story, still is determined to find his way in life. He still thinks there's hope in life, and his captor has essentially fallen out of love with life, and that's the gap between them that he's trying to bridge. So at one level, he's trying to spin stories to delay what he suspects might be his fate, in the sense that the other guy sees 2 more mouths to feed, and our storyteller sees 3 people might have a better chance of surviving if they join forces and talents, and become a community. But in an odd way, our narrator is telling stories not just to save his life and hope that he doesn't get killed in the morning, but he's telling stories. It takes him a while to figure it out, but he's telling the story of his life to himself, to explain, to understand himself, and a kind of a retrospective look at, and it turns out he's got quite a story to tell.
He really does. So the story that he starts to tell is of growing up on this farm with his mother, his widowed mum. They're incredibly self-sufficient. They're known in their hamlet for growing the best fruit and vegetables, and the descriptions of their farm and what they can do are extraordinary. Their life in the season above ground and their life in the season below ground. But the only education he has about the world, the only thing he can believe beyond the hamlet, he's never gone anywhere else, the stories or the sagas his mum tells him. Tell us a bit about Mother. We're going to call her Mother, that's her name. And how does she explain the world to this young man?
Yeah, I mean, she seems to be quite she's an enormously competent person, very, widely respected in the district. And they live outside of the hamlet of about 500 people. They live on a kind of I guess you'd call it an acreage of red dirt and spinifex. And at a certain point in his life, he's been homeschooled by her, and at a certain point in his life he starts to get curious, and she sort of seizes the nettle, I suppose, and in a way, in an attempt to give him a sense of what the world is like, she says, go down the end of the row there and pick an orange. Of course he's affronted by this because the oranges aren't ripe, which seems like a wicked waste, as my grandmother would say. So he goes down and cuts an orange and brings it back to her, and she pulls out her clasp knife, and she makes an incision around the top third, of the orange, and then down around the bottom third, and she pares off all the peel from the orange. So there's a huge naked band around the whole orange. And she says, put it down and come back and look at it tomorrow. And then come back and look at it the day after and the day after. And he does. And, as the middle of the orange all around just starts to dry up and shrivel, she says, that's how the world is. And he gets it and he doesn't get it, in a sense, but he does understand that they are living at the northernmost part of habitable terrain on their continent, and that everybody between them and Northern Asia is gone. You know, that the whole equatorial regions pushing out have become uninhabitable. And she doesn't explain why that's happened.
No.
And almost as though she's waiting, that's for later, maybe.
Yes, it's about to come. They live in a community, and they live as part of in a thing called the association. So it's a kind of a cooperative. And I thought it was really interesting that this is a novel where it's set in the future, but the things that people have returned to in the absence of technology and when the weather is so difficult is a kind of a medieval system of trade and barter. Yeah,
there's no cash, there's no currency. People are deeply, it's almost anathema to think about currency, and there's no capitalism. There's just barter and trade, as they call it. And people are, you know, it's about being skilled and, you know, making or remaking. There's a lot of salvage in their culture, and there's a lot of kind of modesty of means and aspiration. So yeah, people live in sort of small, modest, federated arrangements. You know, little communities that you know that everybody. Yeah, there's a kind of a cooperative, and the organising principle is called the association, which seems to sort of speckle out from district to district, which are pretty sparsely, so that there's no. I mean, I guess it's proceeding under the idea that you know, who's going to keep the satellites in the air? You know, global communications don't work anymore. Yeah. You know, international trade, all that stuff is not. It's gone. It's gone. Everyone's forced back to first principles. Yeah, and people have much less individualistic notions and aspirations. Everyone's much more communal in their approach, and I guess it is a little medieval, and it's kind of feudal without the lords.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you only make what people need. There's not extraneous things.
Well,
it's
just
not
sort of inconceivable to. I mean, just because everything is so precious, water is so precious. Salvage metal is precious, and of course, you know, the biggest things. Manufacturing seems to happen at a distance, and stuff comes up from further south where there are more people and more manufacturing, if you like. So yeah, everyone's generating energy from wind and solar, and there's a lot of effort in nursing one's batteries. Which you know, something that, you know, I'm familiar with. So yeah, it's a careful, slightly reduced or vastly reduced sort of landscape in terms of a human landscape.
And the man in the novel describes the moment, and it is a moment where everything changes for him. He's 17, he's in the marketplace, he needs an axle. Someone says, I've got an axle for you. All I need is 2 hours of your time. And he doesn't quite know what to do, but he says, you know, Hamlet life isn't very interesting, so he goes back that evening. And he has what's called an education. Can you describe, who does he meet? Who are they, and what do they show him?
Yeah, he sort of gets dragooned into this odd meeting, and as you say, you know, life's pretty uneventful out there on the plain. So he sort of goes along, I suppose, and he gets shown this stuff that's sort of unholy and strange. I mean, he essentially gets shown archival material from previous civilizations, and in particular the civilization that they call, you know, the dirty world, or ironically, you know, the 100 Years of Light, which, you know, the reader will probably recognise. And images come up, and first-person accounts and testimony of what life was like and of course he sees images that he can't quite believe. I mean, people with faces that are full, you know, like, and they're shiny like fruit, you know. Their bodies are heavy, and there's images of grotesque excess. You know, he just can't believe, and the machines and the mobility and the kind of liquidity of life beforehand. You know, his ancestors, and it's pretty overwhelming. And then they just sort of explain to him that essentially what he's seeing is the civilization that produced his civilization. Mm. You know, that it produced the reduced conditions of life, and that's troubling. But of course, it's even more troubling when he finds out that the people, his ancestors, knew that their way of life was, and the way that particularly they generated energy, was going to have this consequence, and they did it anyway. And that in literature, and as in, you know, most religious scriptures, an epiphany is an inpouring of knowledge and wonder and lightness and uplift. And of course, this is just like the sky cracks open and 1 million tons of shit pours in on his whole life. I mean, until this moment, he's a proud, competent, hardy homesteader. Mm. You know, he feels he belongs, and he's competent, and he knows what he's doing, and he has dignity. Mm. And in that moment, he's utterly humiliated. Mm. And as you know, it says in the book, he realises that he was born into sorrow and ashes. Mm. And the humiliation of that is really a complete turning point, you know, in his life and in the novel. Mm.
I mean, as there are always in Tim Winton novels, this particular section is full of the most exquisite writing. It's unbelievable. I have to read you one of the lines. He says, "The notion that my burdens were, in essence, other people's sins. It was infuriating to the point of derangement." It's an extraordinary section. And he says as well that I could see 1 billion crimes that make one crime against humanity a crime against the world. So his whole life changes, and it turns out these people who've sort of not indoctrinated him, but unindoctrinated him, sort of, or educated him, are called the service. And they more or less sort of enlist him. And that's where his life really starts to change. I mean, you said before that you didn't give him a name because he was sort of working out who he was and he lived in secret. What's the mission of the service? What do they want to do? Because this is where the novel really sort of changes it into another direction. Yeah,
I guess the setup, you know, is that, you know, they give him this big reveal, and then they say, you know, while he's, you know, almost throwing up and having a panic attack, they say, you know, well, either way, you know, all the people, all the clans and tribes who did this, they still exist, and they're living in luxury in strongholds all over the world. And by the way, we know who they are, because that's come down to us in the archives, and we have a list. And also, by the way, we have the means to get to them. Would you be interested? And you know, if you're 16 or 17 and you're a country boy and you've just been robbed of your whole meaning of your life, and I had to ask myself, you know, as a religious pacifist, what would you do? Because he's so enraged, so furious, realising that you know, the harshness and the miserable prospects of his life. Again, he's been damned for the sins of other people, and they knew, and they didn't care. Everybody wants to think that their ancestors have some aspect of nobility in them. Even those of us obviously trying to digest you know, the facts and the realities of being, you know, a settler society where we're all in the midst of that, you know. But to realise that your ancestors were unmitigated monsters. So yeah, the services essentially sees its role as a sort of janitorial service on behalf of civilization to root out
either janitors or gardeners. They
yeah,
call themselves.
to root out the criminal clans and the oligarchs' bloodlines, all of whom have names, but they're not surnames in the sense of what we would recognise as a surname. They're the sort of names that you might see up on buildings and today, and they're the same names that you'll see advertising their wares, you know, about their environmental values in the Sydney Morning Herald, and lots of it in the Australian, obviously. Generally with, you know, Greg Sheridan giving them 2 thumbs up. Yeah, anyway, I'll stop there. So yeah, they travel the world as a kind of a.
They're kind of activists.
They're resistance.
Yeah.
They're resistance. You know, they're muckizards,
Yeah.
and they are.
You write of them, we were memory itself, awake and afoot. We were relentless. And he says, who's joined them? Who's joined us? And they say, everyone who's awake and organised. It's a real movement.
Yeah. So it's you know, the book takes a whole turn and that was a bit literal.
It's like
sorry.
kind of censorship there.
And so he becomes, in a way, this provincial boy becomes a world traveller at a time when people don't travel. And so he goes weirdly from being ordinary to being a part of I guess you could say a global elite, which becomes more weird and troubling as the novel goes on. Yeah.
So you know, that's their solution, is to weed out everybody, but it's really interesting, you know, as we've said, they're a cooperative. You don't have to join them. Nothing will happen to the boy if he decides to leave. He doesn't have to stay necessarily.
Yeah, it's totally voluntary, yeah.
But the language they use when he becomes an operator, and they've all got these funny, you know, he's taught by someone called geography and he's taught by someone else called ore. They've all got these kind of interesting sort of non-names. But what's fascinating in this section of the book is he starts to travel and go and do these kind of missions. But the language that you've given them about how they do this justice is very kind of neutral language. Almost, dare I say, kind of neutral corporate language.
Well, it's bureaucratic, yeah.
It's bureaucratic language. So
the
targets are called objects.
Yeah.
And getting rid of a target is called acquittal. And you don't just acquit the target or the object, you acquit everyone around them. Their children, their servants, anyone associated with them. Everyone's gone. And it's at this point in the book, it's a really brilliant, I mean, there's so much in there, where up until that point, when you're with the young man and you learn what he's learned, what we know now, what we live with now, what we understand the science tells us about how climate is changing, you think, yeah, vengeance. And then he starts to go on these missions, and the whole question of moral retribution becomes enormously complex for him.
Yeah, I guess their logic is that they can't afford to have these people get power again. So they and because they have ruled the world in a way that, you know, is familiar to us now, when, you know, we can see that our governments are essentially doing the bidding of corporate interests and shills and lobbyists. And when it comes to making hard decisions, they always manage not to make them because they somehow get rounded off, you know, like potty calves. But yeah, so you go from this feeling of shit, these dudes have got it coming, you know, and then your stomach, you just think, oh, really? All the way?
You start to think as a reader, I don't know if I signed up for this, just when the man's like,
yeah.
I don't know if I signed up for this.
Yeah, and so, you know, it becomes this nightmare within a nightmare. I mean, the whole scenario of the book is a nightmare.
Yeah.
but the kind of pitiless logic of vengeance becomes this sort of machine that's inescapable. Yeah.
You said before that when the young man discovers what he discovers, he doesn't experience despair. Or inaction. He's furious and he wants to act. And I want to talk to you about despair later in our conversation. But you mentioned before the idea of humiliation being a kind of fuel and being kind of at the heart of a lot of what this book is about. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I guess I've been really interested in the force that humiliation plays in our lives and in our politics, certainly in our geopolitics, but also here at home, because I think history has shown us that when you suppress and disregard and disrespect a group of people, or an individual or a group of people, whether it's a family or a clan group or a racial group or a religious group, when you humiliate them, when you hold them captive, or you take their lands and you occupy their space, they become paralysed. I mean, I think that's something that Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist, wrote about in North Africa when he was essentially observing and describing the effect that the French occupation of Algeria was having on what they called the native peoples. That there was a kind of a lassitude and a paralysis that the subject peoples were giving off, were showing. But that eventually once, and of course, the French colonial authorities called that, had a racist term for it. It was, North Africa syndrome, because they were Africans. Of course, they're passive, they're lazy, they have, they're malingerers, they have...
Just another way to categorise them.
Yeah. And Fanon said that as soon as the Algerians began to resist, their illness, their condition, quote unquote, evaporated. And as soon as they took steps to resist and to fight for their freedom and their liberty, they but the energy, some of the force of that, at one level it's the aspiration for freedom, but what happens is that, which is ultimately what fueled them, but the humiliation that experienced, it curdles something in people, and it produces, as we know too well in Australia, intergenerational trauma, and a kind of moral damage, a moral injury that is self-perpetuating. And look, I think our news feeds are full 24 hours a day now of the fruit of humiliation. We're seeing people. Essentially, when people feel trapped and humiliated, they lash out. They try all the nice, polite ways of saying, "Excuse me, this is not very fair. Would you mind awfully being nice to us?" And eventually, they become violent. And that violence sometimes infects their own liberty once it's won. Well, not sometimes, very often. And then it's very difficult to evolve beyond it. It happens, but it's very difficult. I think the South African experience is still a problem of digestion in that sense.
And you describe in the book these missions the man goes on, his growing sense of unease, and then his returning to this farm life, and he can't manage it anymore. He's like, all the things that used to make him feel steady and safe and full and steadfast are now dull. He's sort of lost his love of his own life. But you mentioned before that, you know, a lot of the section, so he, you know, he's going out on missions and he's coming back to his mother and trying to lie, and the stories are getting harder and harder to believe. But he's also telling us this story, telling himself this story, and then coming back to the bowman, we'll call him the bowman, the guy with the crossbow down the hole.
Yeah.
And trying to reveal more. And as you say, he discovers that this is the first time he's ever been able to tell anyone, because he's kept this enormous secret all of his life. He's kept this secret from everyone. What did it do to him to live, not just in the shadows, but to live kind of half-lives everywhere he was?
Yeah, look, I think this is an experience that people have written about who've had to, you know, work in secret services of all kinds, civil and military, over history. You know, that a life lived in the shadows, a life of duplicity gets you to the point sometimes, or very often, where you don't know who you are anymore, and you don't know what your true self, which is your true self, and also the kind of the moral attrition of duplicity gets to the point where there seems to be less of you at the end than when you started, and that stuff has always interested me. But yeah, when I mean, it's part of it's just in terms of going away as a provincial and going off and doing this, you know, unseemly, unholy, and unheard of stuff that he does. Some of it's just about adrenaline, you know, and you know, I know I've met people with PTSD who are veterans, and it's not just how can you get them back on the farm after they've seen Gay Paris, which is the whole thing that they used to talk about, you know, in the First World War. It's how your body changes, your mind and your body changes from those incredibly stressful events where you make a shell over your normal, naked, vulnerable self in order to do hard and sometimes horrible things, and at least see hard and horrible things, and then come back to your family as if you're the same person, and you very often aren't.
There's a beautiful description that Tim puts on the page, which is, "It was never again possible, says the man, for me to be properly known by those I loved. Perhaps in the end that was all I ever really wanted, to appear before them as I am, to be and to be seen."
Yeah, that's a tragic. I mean, I think that's an experience, you know, from our time, and perhaps immemorial, you know.
As I said before, like, it is doomy, but it's not all doomy. And I want to lead you to talk about Sun, S-U-N, not the son of the mother, but a beautiful female character called Sun, who's a vet, who comes to the area when the man is he's in his early 20s, or he's just out of his late teens. He meets her, and she is, I mean, she's so vibrant on the page, and she's such an electric character. And it is a moment of great respite for him, where maybe life could be full of something else. Can you introduce us to Sun?
Yeah,
S-U-N?
that's a sort of a part of the tragedy of it is he's already been inducted, you know. So he meets this girl who just, she's obviously much more educated than he is. She's travelled more, she's from the south. She has a kind of a different racial background to him, or ethnic background. It's not really discussed, but you sense that her family are maybe from what used to be called China, which they now call the Hermit Kingdom, because nobody's heard from them for 150 years. And which could be a good thing, you know, but it might not. And she's just, as you said, vibrant, lively, funny, curious, bold, and he feels as if, you know, she's everything he isn't, and he just feels like a dolt, you know, a dullard, a yokel. So he's sort of Jethro Bodine, and in comes, I don't know, Carol Burnett, probably not right.
She's great.
Sorry, this is just an aged cultural reference there for anybody under 50.
No, she's a delight. And probably one of the most beautiful sections of the book, there's a lot of beauty in the book, is when they have their child together. They have a little girl called Esther.
Mm.
And those descriptions of Esther, maybe you could talk about some of those, about he doesn't want to travel anymore, he doesn't want to go on missions anymore, he just wants to be in the space of delight watching this child experience the world.
Yeah, because I mean, in this world, having a child is a big deal. I mean, they even talk about, you know, when you do have a child, you don't go about skiting and showing it off because you don't want to upset people and, you know, rub their noses in it. But it's just the beauty of new life, you know, and he's obviously deeply acquainted with the organic miracle of life in as much as him and his mum are, you know, very gifted growers and propagators. But, you know, this fruit that comes into his life of this little, you know, beautiful child, which they call Esther, not with an H, with, you know, E-S-T-E-R, which is a bit fruity, I suppose, in its way. It's just such a surprise and a delight to him, and I think it just does give me an opportunity to, you know, to go back into that sensual realm, you know, where the little girl in the coolest of the morning, you know, she can be on the red dirt, which looks like paprika. She stuffs it into her mouth and tastes it, and when she goes into the grow houses, she falls in love with the furry stalks of tomatoes. I don't know if anyone who's familiar with growing tomatoes, but many species of tomato they're so hairy and furry, and they leave that smell on you. So she's totally in, and then of course she has to learn, as my grandchildren and my children had to learn, the difference between a tomato and a chili. You know, there's no point telling them; they just got to learn it themselves. So that, yeah, there's kind of a chance for that kind of the lovely, normal human life, the treasure of family, and the crucible of nurture, you know, which in a way, you know, I guess while we're talking about it, I mean, people keep talking about this as a departure for me. This book, it's just more of the same shit, really.
That's the pull quote. It's more of the same shit, really.
But, you know, essentially, the two dudes down a hole trying to figure out whether they're going to kill each other or get along. It's Cloud Street, right? You've got this, you know, boy who's the biggest figure in his life is this enormously competent uber matriarch, you know, who's you know, she's two men and 4 women, you know. He doesn't, the idealised father, you know, is there, of course, but you know, so that's Blueback, you know, and of course as he learns from hard experience that he's on a continent where no matter how much you get inculcated with individualism, rugged individualism as we use it, and particularly in the masculine iteration, you know, regardless of how much you like your own company, this is not a country you can live in on your own. You need mob. You in order to survive and make your way in country and on country and with country, you need to be in company. That's just the rules of the game. That's what country demands. And you know, that's dirt music. You know, there's a dude who's, you know, fallen out of love with life and he wants to go off on his own into what he thinks of as a wilderness and finds out that, you know, just sorry mate, not possible. You know. And so, look, I guess I see this as, and all the stuff about nurture and the problems of loyalty in family, and the problem of how to create and sustain community. Yeah, that's all the same stuff.
I want to come to community in one moment, but I want to ask you one more thing about Sun. Yeah. Because, you know, until this moment, we've had the man, our narrator, has had his mother's worldview and the sagas, which we haven't gone into, which we might. And then he's had the worldview or the information that the service showed him. And then he's had what he's experienced when he goes to these houses of these extraordinarily wealthy people. But Sun gives him another, Sun, S-U-N, the woman he falls in love with and has a child with, gives him this other kind of view of the world. She says, you know, she believes that the world is good and that the world made us. And it's another way of looking at the world that also felt very Winton to me.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
He's here.
Yeah, I'll put the flag up on that one too.
In a beautiful way.
But yeah, her parents, it turns out, are, I guess, what we would think of as intellectuals or teachers. I think they're referred to as scholars.
Yeah.
And so she's had a different kind of education, which is much more curious and much more robustly, sort of critical, I suppose. But it's more nimble, I guess, you know. And so he has a kind of a different model of what a woman is. And of course, you know, then they end up all living together in very snug circumstances, let me tell you. Because, you know, when you got to share an underground bunker with your mother-in-law, where the only sort of respite over summer is what they call chuff, which they grow themselves and smoke. It's so, you know, all the usual dynamics are there, except there's also other dynamics that kind of unfold. So I guess the thing about this boy and his mother, which is both typical and atypical, like many children, and particularly boys, let's be honest, it's hard for them to imagine that their mother has any other life or any other purpose for existing other than to serve their needs. And, you know, then they become adolescents and nothing changes. That's still how they think. And then, of course, they get into their, 20s and 30s and 40s and generally try and pair off with someone who more or less emulates that exact same dynamic, someone to serve their needs. But they very often find it really hard to imagine that their mother has another life except as a maternal, nurturer, provider. And as it turns out, he's so wrong on that front. I mean, all boys are wrong, and men are generally wrong on that front to some degree. But in this instance, his mother has a life that it takes him he's well into his life before he realises that there's a lot more to his mother than he thought.
I want to come to community because it's a huge part of the book. I mean, you described it beautifully and in a very kind of pragmatic way, which is this is both a place and a time where you cannot survive on your own. There's the bowman down the hole who thinks he can because he's too frightened because he thinks the world is awful. Yeah. But, in other books, I mean, you did that wonderful kind of run through of other Winton stories. We've had, recluses and people who exiled themselves. But this book feels like a real celebration of the power of community. It is a celebration of the power of community. And I wanted to ask you why that's such an important part of this story.
I think because, I think because it's true, but I think because it's so urgently required that we take consideration of the power of community in our current moment. We've been trained by pseudo-capitalism for the last 30 or 40 years. The whole neoliberalist notion of making sure that everyone is individuated, everyone is atomised. We're all competitors, we're not allies. We are consumers, not citizens. Our best instincts of forming alliances, joining with one another, bearing one another up, have been stripped away consciously and deliberately by an ideology of domination and suppression, to make the powerful more powerful and to make the poor weaker and more dependent. And I think, given our climate emergency, this is, the climate breakdown is the fruit of that way of living. Plus, it's the fruit of 150 years of fossil capitalism, which has found its apogee in this last 40 years of hyper-capitalism. Just capitalism with trying to find a way of being untrammeled, unrestrained by decency and humanity. And so, we're really on the razor's edge. And some people, particularly powerful people with vested interests, are going to tell you that the genius of the market is going to fix it all for us. It won't. And other people think that the genius of tech is going to solve it for us, which it probably won't. What's going to save us is solidarity. The genius of humanity is in its decency, in the confounding fact of altruism. And the best of us is there. The best that we've ever done comes from that, comes from our capacity to think beyond ourselves as an individual, to think beyond selfishness, beyond the need to defeat all comers all around, to elbow everyone else out of the way so that we get to the trough. That's what's got us onto the brink of oblivion, and I think and we've lost communal muscles. We've lost communal capacities.
What a great phrase, communal muscles.
Yeah, and I think that our ability to join together, to resist, to get organised, to become dangerous again as a polity. Our problem is that we've been trained into passivity by extremely mediocre politicians who are cowed by the shills of the drillers. And they just don't fear us enough. They fear corporate interests more than they fear the demos. And I don't mean that we have to put their heads on pikes, as Andrew Forrest suggested. He's the one who said, mate, they should be putting our heads on pikes. It's like, careful what you say. It's weird.
It's like telling children not to run with scissors.
Yeah.
Right?
But I think that our lawmakers need, our legislators need to worry more about what we think, and we need to wake up and wonder what it is we think. Because essentially, the powers that be just want you to go shopping, because that just keeps you passive. And we all just keep going off to the edge of the cliff. And I just think we need to pull up and say, hang on, is this what we want?
I said that to Tim on the way here, that I'd just been immersed in his extraordinary book, and I was walking up through Martin Place seeing, the Cartier shop and the shiny shoes and all the people and all the suits, and I was like, which world is the real world?
And I just spent, an hour and a half getting from, I don't know what the suburb was, but the city's just, it just shows how vulnerable this way that we're, that we're living. There's many great things about it, but its lack of humility is baked in its own brittleness.
The people in the book, there are mostly people who are fueled by action. They do experience a kind of despair, but they don't stop to think about it. But the people who will read this book, and you've talked to me about it before tonight, are people, you know, you meet a lot of people write to you about their despair, about their kind of eco-grief, to use that phrase. And I wondered, you know, what do you, I mean, you talked about, you know, waking up and getting organised, but how do you help pull people out of that state of grief which can lead to inaction? And do novels like this do it?
Oh, well, that remains to be seen, doesn't it? And people have written beautifully about climate. You know, when I think of James Bradley, his book Clade, Kate Mildenhall's written beautifully about climate. Was that The Butterfly Effect?
Yep.
Robbie Arnott, you know, in several books. My friend Richard Flanagan. It was a book of waking dreams. I can't remember the title. His titles always get me turned around. But I don't really know. I mean, all I can say is that it felt incumbent upon me as a senior practitioner, if I can put myself in back in the cardigan, in the slippers. I had to have a crack, and I think that the only thing I take heart from is that in previous moments in history when people were on the cusp of cataclysm and things were going to shit, you know, when you think of what happened at the end of the giddy years of the 20s when the world economy collapsed, most writers didn't want to address that, but there's a few brave ones that did. And when America had its first, you know, really horrendous climate catastrophe in the Dust Bowl, you know, most of the you know, successful bushy novelists didn't want to go there, but you know, Steinbeck had a crack. And when the rise of fascism you know, started to creep like a stain all over Europe, and most people didn't want to know about it, and the politicians were, you know, in a very similar position to today, basically appeasing and pretending that wasn't happening. You know, a few brave souls wrote about it as reporters and as novelists. And, you know, imagine if Orwell and Hemingway and John Dos Passos and others hadn't had a crack, and you know, whether it's going to Spain or alerting people to, because you know, and you know, think of all the early Jewish writers and thinkers who said, you know, I think something awful is happening here, and people were just called alarmists. I mean, these aren't exactly the same historical moments, but I think they have enough in common to be galvanising to someone like me to feel like it's worth having a crack. And those books made a difference, and I'm so grateful that those writers were courageous enough to risk opprobrium to have a go. In a way, you know, the name of the novel is obviously referring to the forms of energy that people use to, you know, to make their kit go, you know. And of course the world of the novel is a result, the consequence of the way that, you know, we currently make our kit go, you know, the energy that we burn. But in the book, people use the word differently as well. They ask each other, have you got the juice for this job? Have you got the juice to keep going? Have you got the juice to do the hard thing that you know you need to do? And really some of that is courage, physical courage, it's true, but most importantly it's moral courage. And I guess during the writing of the book, I wondered if I was asking myself that question, have you got the juice for this? But I guess I'm asking my culture, and perhaps obliquely, or perhaps not very obliquely, I'm asking, our political leaders and our corporate leaders, have you got the juice to make the right decision? And in the end, it becomes a quite Manichaean, a quite black and white decision. Have you got the juice to make the choice between, whose side are you on, to go back to the 30s, whose side are you on, brother? Are you on the side of life? Or are you on the side of the money? Because the way we're living our life, the way that we're running our economy, it's a death cult. The money ultimately is leading us to oblivion. And it's a pretty fundamental choice. Are you going to make choices that enhance the prospects of life? Or are you just go on the side of nihilism, which is, I think what we're subject to, in our culture. Just like, I'm all right, I don't care, I won't be around. And I hear that a bit. But, one thing I have heard, during the course of this tour even, the number of grandparents and parents, and I'm getting mail from people in the UK whose children are active in the climate movement, some of whom are in jail, some for crimes against perspex. You've got to be careful, perspex is sacred. Some of whom are up on charges, for eccentric parking. Some of them have attachment issues. But essentially they, particularly the parents and the grandparents are saying, I just feel so alienated. My friends think that my kids or my grandkids are criminals, that they're crazy, life-hating, self-hating anarchists, when really they're prophetic voices, and we're proud of them, and I'm just so glad that somebody understands, But I think, there's a lot going on that those of us who are safe and comfortable don't know about, because they're, the more insulated from the realities you are by, your investments and your negative gearing and your super, the harder it is to sense the anguish and the fear and the determination of those young people who are resisting and just more or less saying to us, wrong way, go back.
This is also a novel about stories. It's the story that the man in the hole tells to the bowman to stay alive. It's the story that he's told himself in his head that he's never told to anybody else. And then we have the story you're telling us as we read the book. And I wondered if you could just, before we finish tonight, reflect a bit on how the stories we tell about our world shape us and how the stories we tell might wake us up.
Yeah, look, I think, we live in a culture where we're told that art is a frippery. It's just a luxury and an added extra once you've got all the serious stuff organised. But I think if we can just talk about storytelling, I think it's a fundamental human need. And having had the enormous privilege of being able to sit in middens where you can put your fingers into the lives and the artefacts and storytelling of people that goes back, 40,000+ years. There's always the hearth, and there's the preparation of food. It's present in the bones, all broken. There's the tool making from the stone tools and artefacts, and it's all about holding together. And of course, the caves are very often got storytelling on them, and often the actual artefacts, in in the hearth amongst the charcoal are parts of symbolic objects, symbolic behaviour, storytelling. It's as deep as humanity goes. And here on this continent, humans have been doing that for as long as humans have been human. And story is what binds us together, and it can be what entraps us. The stories we tell are the carriages we travel in, if you like, the vessels we travel in. I mean, Les Murray used to talk about, you know, we're all living in one poem or another. And I think my grandparents and my parents were living in a different poem to the one we're living in now. And you know, that's what bears us up. And sometimes when it becomes a story that's not good for us anymore, or it changes, it becomes, because you know, I think think about you know, Germany in the 30s and the story that took hold, and how powerful it was, how it enchanted a whole people to accept, you know, unspeakable acts and unspeakable attitudes, and then unspeakable events. That was about you know, a population becoming enchanted and indentured to an evil story, you know. But stories are also liberating, and I think, you know, again, on this continent, the continent became meaningful because it was woven together with songs and stories. It became livable and coherent. I mean, there's one thing I have learnt, you know, over the years from countrymen, is that people need country, right? That's just an organic fact. But country needs people. And I don't know if most people who live in the metropolitan south understand that in your lifetime, the northern part of Australia will probably begin to empty out because it's unlivable. It's already, you know, many parts of northern Australia are becoming uninsurable. Everything is getting tougher. You know, ethical lenders are getting increasingly sceptical about giving you a mortgage on places, you know, north of the 26th parallel, but depending on the climate particularities. But in the not too distant future, everyone's coming south. And anyway, it's all very well to say that you stop the boats. But how do you stop the utes? Anyway, so how did I get there?
We did start a little bit late, and we have been together now with Tim for an hour. In a moment, I'm going to hand back to the wonderful Dan Jordan from Roaring Stories, but I wanted to close by sharing something with you. A lot of people write about Winton, but there's a beautiful book by the Australian author Geraldine Brooks as part of the Writers on Writers series, and she says this about the work of Tim Winton: "This is the work great writers do. They reveal us to ourselves. They show us who we are and who we might become. They stand us up where the light is bright, harsh even, and hold the mirror so close that we cannot look away." And I think that is such a beautiful summary of what you've done for us for years, Tim, for showing us who we are and who we might be, and for this powerhouse of a book that's about hope, that's about action, about what it looks like to take care of each other, and about the power of community, and about being awake in this beautiful world, the only one we have. Thank you all for being here. Please join me in thanking Tim Winton.
Thank you.